Okay, dear participants, let's start. So after a very active discussion of macroeconomic aspects of coronavirus, we are launching our second part of the conference devoted to climate issues. And this part is organized jointly by the School of World Economy of the High School of Economics and the Laboratory for Climate Change Economics at the same university. Before the panel session with various speakers and discussants, we will start with the keynote speech by Gernot Wagner, whom I very happy to see here. Gernot is a associate professor at the Department of Environmental Studies and associate clinical professor at the New York University Wagner School of Public Service. And I should also introduce very briefly Gernot. Prior to joining New York University, he was the founding executive director of Harvard Solar Geoengineering Research Program, a research associate at the Harvard John Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Science, and a lecturer on environmental science and public policy at Harvard. Before Harvard, he served as an economist at the Environmental Defense Fund. He also taught at Columbia, Harvard, New York University, and has been a term member of the Council of Foreign Relations. Gernot is also a co-author together with Martin Weitzman, absolutely prominent environmental economist. They were the co-authors of the book, which is called Climate Shock. And I actually really give you an advice to read it if you did not do it yet, because it is worth reading without any doubt. Gernot, we are very happy to have you here, and so the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Igor, and thank you for this generous introduction. So yes, I am obligated to show you my book title here, Climate Shock. Today I would give a sort of broad overview. Sitting here in New York, which started as the epicenter of COVID here in the US. Now I have to say, unfortunately, it no longer is. Now we have many other epicenters here in this country. But what I'd like to do, not to preclude the more technical discussion to come in as rather exciting panel following this hour now, I'd just like to give sort of a high-level overview of a bit of my thinking and a bit of what I think is sort of the general connections between climate on the one hand, COVID on the other. And in some sense, I guess the broadest, highest level connection is precisely this. Lots of things we see with climate happen with COVID. They just happen a lot faster. So when we look at sort of the typical COVID data, right, and we have seen versions of this now for months and months and months. I never thought I would follow quite as many epidemiologists on a daily basis ever in my life, on Twitter and off. Right, there was sort of this first wave of COVID infections sometime in March. We all wrote op-eds, we all wrote the first slew of papers around what it all means, what we should all make of this. Well, by now we've gone through a second wave. Here in the US, we are in the third wave of COVID infections, right? And the lessons, the seeming lessons we thought we would learn back then, well, some of us, I suppose, have learned them, right? There's certainly some countries that don't even frankly show up on this graphic, right? Because they have basically contained the virus, right? We can always look to South Korea or Taiwan or New Zealand, Australia even, as examples, as stellar examples that have basically done what we all thought should be, could be done. China, for that matter, doesn't show up here on on this graphic, right? Now, of course, I'm not plotting all countries here, but when you look at different responses to this situation, it is striking how exponentially different these responses have been. And what is also striking, of course, is precisely the speed, right? So there's lots and lots of examples we can go through. Here's one, right? So this is Emmanuel Macron going to the theater on a Friday, March 6th. He goes on a stroll in Paris on March 8th, Sunday, 2 days later, essentially demonstrating normalcy, right? No masks, no social distancing. Well, 2 days later, his culture minister contracts COVID. That's Tuesday. Thursday of that same week, he addresses the nation and the country is shut down. That is a learning curve, if there ever was one, right? This is exponential growth on overdrive. And here we're looking at, somebody who many of us would consider one of the, more rational leaders in all of this, right? There is no Donald Trumpian, Trumpism here. There is no, trying to fake the data, trying to, or, at least as far as we know, there's none of that happening. There is somebody who basically tries to take his job seriously and tries to act according to the best information, presumably. And he, right, within a week prior, he thought, apparently, his advisors thought, that he could, quote unquote, beat this virus somehow differently, or that the path somehow in Paris, in France, would turn out differently. Well, he couldn't. Right? Okay, so not to bore us too much here with every one of us looking at me trying to do math here live, but I think one substantial lesson in all of this is, in fact, that exponential growth drives everything. Right? And of course, right, this is not just COVID, it is climate too. But since we're all in the COVID mode here for now, and we have seen this R0 number, let me just go through some of the sort of fundamental logic here that, again, many of us have seen, that we all somehow, by now at least, understand when we go through the math. Intuitively, I have to tell you, I've now taught this stuff, exponential growth, at how Igor generously introduced me at a bunch of different universities, lots and lots of different student cohorts. I can tell you, it doesn't matter who it is. Nobody understands this intuitively. Some of us might be able to do this math in their head. Nobody understands it intuitively. And when I say, it is basically this idea of, right, exponential growth on overdrive. So, for example, not to be, too complicated here, but, if you have a Reproduktionsfaktor for COVID of 1, well, after 10 interactions, right, 1 times 1 times 1, 10 times, well, the 10th person still infects 1 person. Okay, fine, that was easy. What about an R0 of 2? Well, we can all do the math here, and we get to 1,024, 2 raised to the 10, right? So apparently the input is twice as bad, which, by the way, should be bad enough already, right? But of course, it's nothing compared to the output, which is 1,000 times as bad. Okay, well, we can keep going. I'll just do one more here, right? What is 3 to the 10? I won't quiz you right now. I, of course, didn't do this in my head either. It's approximately 60,000, right? This is exponential growth. It's exponential growth on overdrive. And of course, right, what we see here is that the difference even between very, very small inputs matters. It matters a lot. And yes, right, this is where sort of the rational leaders come in again, right? You literally have Angela Merkel, right, the German chancellor, literally on live TV, right, addressed to the nation, go through Reproduktions, R0s, right, German word, Reproduktionsfaktoren, right? So she literally explains this stuff on live TV front of a few million Germans, which some of us, right, me sitting here in the US, I can only dream of having a president who understands this, him or herself, and then be able to explain it, and basically take the time to say, look, people, this matters. And when I say this, right, yes, of course, it is this exponential growth. It is the fact that it's not about where we are today, it's where we are going. Okay, end of COVID lesson, right? I'm not an epidemiologist, I play one on Twitter. I certainly don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to these epidemiological models, but of course, the same applies to climate too, right? So here's one of these standard climate damage functions that we've all studied, used, applied in certain forms. Everyone knows Bill Nordhaus's DICE model. Well, there is a very standard input into this DICE model. It is climate damages, degrees centigrade on the x-axis. In this case, it's euros, but some kind of dollar monetized damage on the y-axis. Okay, well, there too, right? Whether this line is technically exponential or is technically quadratic or something else, in many ways doesn't matter. What matters is that a relatively small change in temperatures in the input here, the x-axis, leads to massive, massive differences on the y-axis, right? Of course, this is here, blown up for dramatic effect. But yes, the difference between 1 and 1.5 degrees isn't just 50% more damages. It is much, much more than that. The difference between 1 and 2 degrees isn't twice as bad. It is significantly worse. How much worse? Okay, this is now, right, where high-level keynotes leave the room and where actual work is happening, right? Where the Climate Impacts Lab, Michael Greenstone, Saul Shung, Bob Kopp, and many, many others, right, have worked very, very hard trying to do these calculations. But the sort of high-level conceptual idea is crucial. And back to, it's not me, dumping on my students here, but sort of summarizing my sort of experience, classroom experience, if you will, right? You have some pretty smart students who sort of get these calculations, who can even do 3 raised to the 10 in their head, right? I had to use a calculator to get to 60,000. There are some people who can do this in their head immediately. Well, even they don't grasp intuitively what that means, what that ought to mean for policy, right? And again, sort of high-level conceptual, right? So this is now, right, credit here goes to Marty Weitzman, of course, who originated these ideas in a series of peer-reviewed papers. It is all about details. And no, we don't know what the actual input is, right? I'm not drawing these two lines here to say that one is better than the other. The short answer is we simply don't know. Or put differently, in slightly more technical terms, right? Every one of these temperature inputs has a PDF associated with it. When I say PDF, of course, it's not what Adobe Acrobat gives us, but a probability density function, right? There is no point output here. There is a distribution. And the fact that we cannot exclude the high temperature tail on the one hand, that's the x-axis here, right? Even if average temperature predictions tell us a doubling of CO2 leads to 3 degrees centigrade of warming, and since we are doubling CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, right, we are well on the way on that one. We started at 280 parts per million. A doubling, of course, is 560. By now, we have passed 410 easily. I think we're like 415 or so at this point globally. Yes, we will get to a doubling unless we act dramatically to cut CO2 emissions. Not just a little bit, to 0, right? Okay, so that's one, right? PDF here, the sort of the one in the background. Well, the other one, of course, is all about the damages, right? We don't know whether the dotted line, the quadratic line, is the correct one, or something much, much steeper. And frustratingly, in many ways, the difference doesn't matter to where we are currently looking, right? So right now, we've already warmed the globe by about 1 degree centigrade. So we're at the very left on this axis here. Well, you know, in some sense, by definition, because I've calibrated this way here, the difference doesn't matter. Even at 2 degrees centigrade, the difference may not matter all that much relative to if you go out to the tail. And of course, right, in our proper climate economic analysis that is fully probabilistic, that doesn't take point estimates, what goes on out there at the tail matters. It matters a lot. Or put differently, it may well drive the final result. Yes, what happens at the mean, the median, the average, the most likely value is bad enough. But even a tiny probability, right, 1%, 5%, 10% probability of high temperature increases would lead to massive, massive economic damages in expectations, which ought to, of course, drive the final outcome, right? Now, okay, point one, right, the link between COVID and climate. It is all about the tails. It is all about the growth rate. Yes, levels today might be bad enough, right? Back to this graph from before here, just for COVID cases per million people. Today's levels might be bad enough. Well, today, literally today in the US, we have Thanksgiving, right? Sort of the biggest travel holiday of the year, usually. Well, turns out it still is, even this year, right? CDC, the Center for Disease Control, told us all to stay at home and not go travel yesterday and the day before in order to celebrate today's holiday. Well, guess what? More planes in the sky yesterday than any year before on the day before Thanksgiving, right? So none of these trends changed. So yes, I'm looking at the trend line here for the US, right? This isn't going to peak anytime soon. It is only going to go up and up and up. So how bad it was in March around here in New York and elsewhere, well, we've passed that. We're well past that. And the trend line, of course, are only pointing up. Okay, it's about trends, not about levels. It's about growth rates, not about where we are today. Point one, comparison one. Point two, right? Now I'm not telling any economist anything new here, but yes, it is all about the externalities, right? Wearing masks is not to protect yourself. Yes, that too, but primarily it is to protect others, of course, right? Which, of course, makes this such a difficult problem, right? I won't get too much, or I won't get at all into the politics of this, at least for now, but it is amazing to watch in this country the polarization around all of this. Okay, well, might as well. So right, here's the politics of it, right? It is this dramatic difference in outlooks of one half, approximately half, that is basically looking at this problem and says, wow, we need to protect others from ourselves, hence masks. And the other that basically screams freedom or something else, and that basically leads in the exact opposite direction, right? This sort of fundamental understanding, what do externalities mean? Sort of economic terms, if you will. I always call this at infamous paper title, Coase versus the Coasians, right? Ronald Coase himself would not be advocating for a laissez-faire, hands-off, we can all solve this problem ourselves here solution, right? Ronald Coase himself would say, wait a second, it takes transaction costs to be zero and it takes full property rights for my Coase theorem to apply in order to say that it does not take government to step in. Well, none of that applies here. Yes, it takes government policy. Of course it does. Okay, so maybe a bit more on this polarization, right? Just because it's fun to look at. This is actually from 4 years ago, right? You separate the US into city and country, or states and counties that vote for one party versus the other, blue versus red states, Clinton/Biden versus Donald Trump. And yes, cities got hit hard first, but of course that picture has since reversed. This graph goes through June. It's only, of course, gotten worse since then. So yes, politics matters a lot. Massive political polarization matters a lot. Okay, now, yes, there's a breath of fresh air here, right? We are back to a world now where a president proudly says that he takes science and scientific input seriously. Of course, very little will change between now and January 20th. If anything, it's only going to get worse in terms of polarization. And back to the first point on growth rates and how the trends matter, right? There is only so much one can do immediately when fundamental forces point in the opposite direction. Okay, politics. Let me just stop there for now. Happy to, of course, go into details during the questions and answers. Meanwhile, there's, of course, a more direct comparison too, right? It is about this link between COVID and emissions. For local pollution, local air pollution, we saw a massive change, a massive impact of COVID policy on pollution levels, which, by the way, right, so if you now run the numbers, and some have, for China in this case, turns out there are massive public health impacts of air pollution. Well, due to those lockdowns, those local air pollutants basically disappeared almost overnight, saving so many people as to possibly make COVID overall actually a net positive event for public health. Local air pollution went down by so much. Yes, many people have died, but of course this picture has repeated itself over and over again, that the decrease in deaths on the one hand from traffic fatalities on the one hand, and then of course air pollution very directly, that there may well be a net positive impact here vis-a-vis some local air pollutants. Very different, of course, for climate, right? So there too, we have seen this massive impact on CO2 emissions. Massive in the sense of, right, so we emit about 100 million tons of CO2 globally per day. There was about a decrease of around 17 million tons, conveniently around 17% at the peak in early April, mid-April, in CO2 emissions globally. Of course, right, when you continue this to further out, now we are again in sort of a second lockdown, so emissions will have decreased a little bit again starting early November. But of course, right, for the whole year, emissions only, quote unquote, decreased globally by between 3 and 5%. Sort of for the US alone, it might be as high as 9 or 10%. But globally, emissions, of course, didn't decrease by the full 17% we saw sort of at the peak. Equally important, this is a decrease in emissions, right? What matters to global temperatures is concentrations. Well, concentrations will have increased by slightly less this year, but of course, they will have still increased. Or in other words, one lesson I take from this is how COVID simply isn't a template for what to do to address climate change, or maybe more directly, individual action, even on a massive, massive scale, right? Sort of all of us literally going back to our caves or, you know, apartments, homes, as the case may be. And you know, nobody travels. Nobody should have traveled. Nobody commutes, has been commuting. And still, we cannot decrease emissions at the peak by more than these 17-ish%. What does that mean? Well, it means addressing climate change is not about inaction. It is not about withdrawing. It is not about doing less. It is about more activity, more investment, more green stimulus, or whatever else it might be, looking toward investing, spending money on transforming the economy from this high carbon, low efficiency pathway we're on right now to a low carbon, high efficiency one, right? The exact opposite of what we have experienced. Now, of course, these changes are underfoot, right? We have these long-term targets being announced left and right? So the Japanese prime minister, new Japanese prime minister, one of his very first acts was to announce carbon neutrality for Japan by 2050. This, of course, is the Chinese president in September at the General Assembly, at the virtual General Assembly. This is actually him live speaking here, announcing China to go carbon neutral by 2060. We have goals for, well, the European Union has a goal for 2050. Some individual countries have goals for 2040. Uruguay has a goal for 2030. Joe Biden has a plan for the electricity sector in the US, carbon neutrality by 2035, right? These are massive, massive changes in political outlook. You know, from a sort of climate environmental perspective, many of these goals may well be too weak still. But the fact that we're basically looking now more or less to a race to the top of sorts, right? If I put my political scientist hat on, 5-ish years ago, we all were writing papers about how to motivate individual rational actors to do more at the country level. Right now, we are in this, whatever you want to call it, virtuous cycle spiral where basically leaders apparently outdo each other with these announcements. Now, of course, right, it's a long path between announcement like this and actual implementation. But still, well, one reason may well be something like this, right? This was a couple of weeks ago, 3 or so weeks ago at this point, The Economist putting 21st Century Power on its cover, and basically talking about the move from petrostate to electrostate. China produces 72% of all solar PV panels globally. It produces over 70% of all lithium-ion batteries globally. It produces more than 45% of all wind turbines globally, right? Massive industrial policy, right? This is not necessarily, quote unquote, the free market here. This is massive industrial policy interventions. This is the 13th five-year plan, or for that matter, looking forward to the 14th five-year plan being announced in March of next year, and the changes happening due to that. And yes, of course, right, not everything is rosy here with this transition to an electrostate dominated by a global power like China. On the other hand, yes, of course, these sorts of political goals, political reactions are not just much needed, but they frankly explain a lot
это
of this
политические
rapid
реальности, которые
transition.
во многом объясняют вот это быстрый переход.
Okay, now,
Так,
yes, there's lots of other changes afoot too.
да,
Right.
много других перемен
This is
происходит.
London.
Также это Лондон.
So what we see here is
Мы
we
здесь
have
видим
this massive change, quick
огромный перемен.
change not just in London, not just in nice Western capitals, in lots and lots of places where local politics suddenly shifted dramatically from basically a situation where we fighting against politics, right? We as sort of environmental economists interested in internalizing externalities, fighting against the politics, looking at shifts where the politics more or less align with the overall goals. No, cycling alone isn't going to solve the problem. We all know that. But yes, some of this transformation, of course, starts in cities, right? Now, apologies for the German here on this graph. This is cars in Austria, right? Small Western European country, happens to be where my accent is from. But when you look at the difference between the city, the one big city, Vienna, the green line on the bottom, and the rest of the country, this is cars per 1,000 people. Well, the one thing to see, of course, is half as many cars in the city, right? That's not a surprise. What might be a surprise is massive trend increases on the top, decreasing trend on the bottom, continuing decreasing trend on the bottom. So I realized this is now this is the wrong language here. This was my summer project. I went back to write a book in German. So instead of going back to Austria over the summer, I wrote for my very first time in my professional life anything in German, really. This is about city, country, climate. And yes, of course, frankly, some of the changes that we see globally, the fact that China is peaking its emissions now well before its previously declared goal of 2030, but is peaking its emissions possibly as soon as this or next year. CO2 emissions in this case has a lot to do with these massive urbanization forces. Two quick more points.
Европейские столицы, уменьшение количества автомобилей на 1000.
Yes, we see technology.
Так, здесь мы также видим роль
technological change, right? This is the two Turkish immigrants to Germany who are now sort of at the head of the effort to roll out a coronavirus vaccination. We see technological change having had a huge impact both on the COVID front and the climate front.
Огромное влияние оказали как на фронте ковида,
what we also see, of course, is that none of this technological innovation stops us now from having to intervene politically, right? If anything, we ought to be doing more now because we see that there is this vaccination on the horizon that applies to COVID, it applies to climate as well, right? There is no simple techno fix here. There is no one intervention that will tell us, and here is the one fix that will solve it all. What there is a massive systemic problem. And back to my original point, COVID might be bad enough. Climate, of course, is much, much worse. So with that, I think we have about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes for Q&A. Let me stop here and happy to discuss the most important topics here.
Yes, thank you, Gernot, for your fascinating presentation. Actually, I think that I will start with a couple of questions as a moderator, probably. Actually, during
Я думаю, что я начну как модератор.
All of the participants were separated, divided into two groups, optimists and pessimists. I think that you should be, you will be in the optimist group, of course. Yes, you really.
Fair enough.
You really believe that the humanity may cope efficiently with climate change and may have a sufficient political will for this. Actually, you are now virtually located at the probably optimist part of the world. But most of the participants here, they are located in the pessimist part. And many people in my country, they are very skeptical, not about climate change itself. Actually, Russia is a rather skeptical country, but it changes really. And so more and more people really take it seriously. But many people in my country do not believe that the efficient strategies for emission reduction globally they really exist. And they may believe that they may exist in the European Union because it is, it is rich enough, or they may even exist in US. So with all the problems of your political system and the polarization of the country, still it is possible there. But many people in this country do not believe that it is possible in emerging economies, in the developing worlds, which actually amounts for more than half of the global emissions. Yes, we have China, and it is important really, and China starts changing, though not as fast as it may follow from the announcements and from the declarations of Xi Jinping, but still it is changing. But there are many other countries which are quite poor still, which have many other priorities except for climate change, and which have very high discount rates, which have very expensive capital for financing green projects, and many other problems. So what can you say to these pessimist people who are quite numerous in this part of the world?
Well, so first of all, I can be very pessimistic too, so let me try. Of course, right? So it is one thing to announce grandiose targets. It is quite another to look to the day-to-day politics. So, okay, let's look to the US. Joe Biden's climate plan, the plan, prior to November 3rd election, and by some accounts the election is still going on, so that's right. Let's not get into that necessarily. His plan was more ambitious than any prior presidential candidate of a major party ever. So some of us right here might know Bernie Sanders as sort of the most lefty politician out there, prominent politician out there in the US. Biden's climate plan in 2020 was more ambitious than Bernie Sanders' climate plan of 2016. That is a massive change. Or even more in the weeds here, my first act coming out of my PhD in 2007 now was to work with Environmental Defense Fund on this massive cap and trade push, was called the Waxman-Markey bill, right? That bill passed the House, it failed in the Senate, right? Big policy failure during the first Obama term. And no, we don't have, right, a nationwide carbon price in this country. Well, Waxman, the congressman Waxman, is now known for basically co-sponsoring, co-authoring as a senator what is often called the Green New Deal, which is sort of this complete push, for $100 trillion style investment and so on. And of course, by now it's sort of, anyone can read into it whatever they want to. And of course, it's become this massive political straw man in any sense. But this massive change, right, in outlook from sort of, nimble cap and trade system with a $20 per ton of CO2 carbon price to a much more fundamental transformation of the US economy as the goal, right? That alone is an important sea change. Okay, Igor, so this was still just the US, right? So what about the rest of the world? Well, I think one pessimistic thing, to stick with the pessimism theme here for a minute, is yes, you can have these goals internally. China is, of course, a good example, right? So yes, I do believe that China's 13th five-year plan now and the 14th five-year plan being written now by NDRC and rolled out by March 2021 will have a significant impact on the trajectory of Chinese emissions. And there too, change is much, much faster than anyone imagined, 5-10 years ago. 2014, we had this goal of Chinese emissions peaking by 2030. By now, it looks like that peak will happen by 2025 at the very latest. By some accounts, it has already happened. Now, when I say emissions, it is emissions inside China. Meanwhile, Belt and Roads Initiative is a $4 trillion investment plan from the Chinese government, right, for massive, massive investments abroad outside China. $750 billion of that has since been spent on energy projects, the vast majority of it on fossil fuel infrastructure, right? So while there may well be a lot of optimism within, right, where do these investments go? Well, many, many emerging economies, right? East Africa as a prominent example, and many of these investments are in fact in coal, gas, oil infrastructure. That infrastructure is here to stay for decades to come. Even right now, China is building coal-fired power plants within China, right? So no, certainly not all is rosy. And yes, there is going to be, over the next years, decades, this, frankly, global power play that we are going to see, where some countries basically make the switch. China may well be the most prominent, most important one that has massive state interests in accelerating the switch to low carbon, zero carbon technology. Doesn't just include solar and wind, by the way, right? The small modular nuclear reactors, for example, right, are certainly part of this picture. At the same time, there's certainly going to be other powers, right? Russia may well be the most prominent example here, right? Gazprom isn't going to switch to wind and solar anytime soon, right? If anything, we are currently locking in fossil fuel infrastructure for years, for decades to come, even in countries like Germany, right? So while Germany may be on the forefront of this transition away from coal toward renewables internally, well, we have gas lines being built as we speak through the Baltic, right, to transfer Russian gas to German households, to German industry. That shift will happen for quite a while. That infrastructure will stay in place for quite a while to come. And yes, of course, right? So what I call sort of the three horsemen of the climate policy apocalypse, right? There's the rebound effect. Essentially, if you have any kind of energy efficiency goal, we may well be using more of the energy input now than before, right? So you have CAFE standards for driving. Cars suddenly are more efficient. Meanwhile, we have people drive more because driving is cheaper. So that's one. Second of course, is carbon leakage, right? Which is precisely where BRI comes in, where the gas pipeline comes in going into Germany. And the third one is the green paradox, right? Temporal leakage, which for us economists is one of these sort of Harold Hotelling model style stories, right? It's the Hotelling model on overdrive, where you essentially have resource producers spend a significant amount of effort to ramp up capacity now in anticipation of stricter climate policy later on. Now, of course, from a political economy perspective, we see what this leads to, right? We basically have now massive amounts of lobbying for the existing infrastructure that will only increase in anticipation of stricter climate policy later. And we see that, right? And yes, to go back to your question, Igor, we see that primarily, of course, in resource-dependent emerging economies. There's some noble examples on the other end. For the most part, I would say the pessimistic outlook here is certainly justified as well.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Gernot. So I open the floor for questions. Please, all the participants, feel free to write down your questions in chat or just push the raise the hand button, or just write down in the chat that you want to ask a question. Please, let's start with Ilya Stepanov.
I'm going to switch your mic. Yes, now it's working. Thank you, Gernot, so much for your wonderful presentation and your optimistic view on the future in terms of low carbon development. I have a question which is kind of an add-on to what Igor just asked. Developing countries probably will have higher opportunity costs of low carbon transition, especially in the light of COVID-19. So they will still have to solve basic social problems. Of course, in the developed country, there are massive troubles like in the medicine and other social spheres, but in developing countries, these issues would be quite pressing in the years to come. So, and especially in the light of crisis, the low carbon transition could be a hard solution for them. Do you envision any sort of framework differences? Well, I mean, differences in frameworks for climate policy in developed and developing countries? I mean, can we sort of adapt the solutions like carbon pricing or any other sort of well-spread climate policy solutions in developed countries to developing ones, and in Russia, for example? Or if there are any sort of framework differences in the approach which both type of countries should follow, especially in the light of crisis? One more time, thank you for your presentation.
Great question, and Ilya, let me just commend you on the combination of coffee machine and economics textbooks behind you. That's an amazing background.
One of these books is yours, actually.
Okay, cool. I wasn't saying that, but you know, just the image itself is amazing. So in some sense, yes, of course, right? Now, on the other hand, and when I say yes, of course, right, difference in approaches, but, you know, sort of very high level, and, you know, looking at Franziska Funke coming in soon, right, with sort of actual research to go with some of that, right, coming out of INET, that will actually, you know, that actually goes into the sectoral differences here and basically tries to figure out what are the appropriate policies sector by sector. Let me just make 2 points here. So one, at a very high Econ 101 level, right, none of that should in fact make a difference, which can either tell you, can tell you one of two things. One is that the Econ 101 approach just isn't sufficient, right? So, you know, guilty as charged, right? But us economists for decades have been running around basically saying the efficient approach, the cost-effective approach is a carbon price, and then you get out of the way and everything else will just happen. Okay, now let's talk concrete numbers here for a second, right? So Bill Nordhaus, who has won a Nobel Prize for his efforts on putting together the STICE model. That was sort of the main, part of the not everything, but the main part of the Nobel Prize citation here, right? This focus on the benefits and cost analysis of climate. Okay, history of DICE, 1992, when it was first published. His optimal carbon price in today's dollars was $2.50, right? By now he is at $35 per ton of CO2. ExxonMobil, not to pick on, one company here, but they're usually the bad guy in this one, so let's pick on them, right? I don't know Gazprom's position, so let me stick with Exxon. ExxonMobil supports a carbon price in the US of $40 per ton of CO2. ExxonMobil is advocating for more, stronger, stricter climate policy than the latest peer-reviewed paper by Bill Nordhaus. Right? Now, that's amazing, just to put it mildly. Right? Meanwhile, and yes, right, to be clear, right, so I too have a copy of this book, Ilya, so right, I have it here, right, so the late Marty Weitzman, right, would look at this, and full disclosure, right, so of course I drank the Weitzman Kool-Aid on this one, right, so co-author of mine, but Marty Weitzman would look at this and say, wait a second, look at the uncertainties, look at the unknowns. $40 just isn't the right price. And by the way, right, many of us who've played around with Nordhaus's dice model, and then right, every time you change a small assumption, the price doesn't just increase from $40 to $45 or $35 to $40. It increases massively. Right, this latest Nature climate change paper that just came out a few months ago, Hensel and Drupp and many others. When you modernize the inputs, the damage functions, and so on, suddenly the social cost of carbon increases from $40 to $100 at least. Possibly much higher, $200 and more. Okay, what does that have to do with your question, or what does that mean about the difference in policy? Well, a $40 carbon tax, a $40 carbon price, Econ 101 style, yeah, that's that's a sensible, easiest thing to say. Like, you have oil companies supporting this. Yeah, of course, it's still a massive political lift, but frankly, again, if Exxon wants it, if they really wanted it, yeah, it would happen. Right, $100, $200 per ton of CO2 or higher, right? Germany talking about a social cost of carbon internally are like $600, $800, right? That's not an Econ 101 answer anymore. There is no country on the planet where you could have a carbon tax of $500 per ton of CO2. $500 per ton of CO2, right? Here in US terms, cents per gallon, right, is $5 per gallon of gasoline at the pump. Gasoline right now costs around $2 per gallon, right? That's a 250% increase in the price of gasoline. Just isn't going to happen. So, Econ 101, sort of the simple framework, single framework as a solution. Yeah, that could have happened, in the early 90s. Fine, maybe in 2000, maybe 2010. In many ways, by now, we simply know too much. We know too much about the social cost of carbon to know that an Econ 101 approach just isn't going to give us the right answer. Okay, fast forward to what could give us the right answer. Well, it has to be a combination of, yes, pricing the negative externality on the one hand, but of course, also internalizing the positive externality, technological change, lots and lots of other solutions, right? Backstop technologies, what us economists call backstop, right? What the technologists would call, in this context, air capture, right? Sucking CO2 out of thin air. Well, pretty much, very expensive as we speak, but actually, it's sort of in the, $200 to $600 per ton of CO2 range as we speak. And by the way, it doesn't matter where in the world you suck out CO2, right? A ton of CO2 is a ton of CO2. So yeah, you have these startups come up right now that, by the way, for $200 or $600 a ton, will take a ton of CO2 out of the atmosphere for you. Now, very, very few of us are willing to pay that much money per ton of CO2 right about now. But of course, right, a technology, the price will only come down over time, which may well be the sort of backstop technology that we're really looking at. Now, if that's optimistic or pessimistic, I'll let others decide, right? But we certainly can't ignore this. What we certainly can't do is draw these social cost of carbon lines that start at whatever value we want today and basically increase over time smoothly, right? That's just not the picture, right? Sort of in my own work, maybe we have a high price today that actually decreases over time because of lots of different factors, uncertainty, lots of other things, and of course, backstop technology as well. Okay, different frameworks, how to look at this? Well, in some countries, rapidly developing low-income countries, the emphasis, yes, while us economists would still say, put a carbon price, on CO2, put a price on CO2, of course, right? That would help in the efficient, cost-effective transformation. But maybe the emphasis ought to be fully on technology, fully on infrastructure investments, fully on many, many other factors that basically help us transform economies, or for that matter, avoid the paths we are on currently entirely, through much, much cheaper interventions than even the quote-unquote cost-effective carbon price would lead us to believe. Right? It's a combination of policies, and that combination, of course, will change from country to country.
Thank you, Gernot. And actually, we have such discussion in Russia because we have no carbon price right now. But yes, the discussion about it exists, and there are different points of view about it. Some people really believe that carbon price in Russia is the best way, as everywhere in the world. But others say that the Russian economy is very different from the economies of the European countries or the US economy, and it is. It already has, it is very dependent on fossil fuels first, and this fossil fuels is already taxed very heavily, actually. So we have some indirect carbon price within this fossil fuel taxation, and so on. So this question is not only about abstract country, but it is also about Russia.
Exactly.
Actually, we have another question from Igor Baryshev. Igor, please, you may intervene right now.
Yes, I can make orally. My question is an optimistic question. My optimism is through my pessimism. Yes, our situation is not bad. It is not good. It is a clear situation. We can't expect justified impacts from different countries. But I regard the climate agenda as a global equalizer. Yes, rich countries will spend much more, and rich people will spend much more. So what? Less. Does the speaker assume the rich would start a hot climate war?
Do you understand the question, Gernot? Because I'm not sure that I do understand, actually.
So let me try to paraphrase. So you're saying, so rich countries have caused the climate problem, right? So the responsibility lies on rich countries, right?
Not the responsibility. They will. They have two options: agree and spend, and disagree and start the war, because they are rich, so they are strong. How do you think? What a choice will they make? Will they make? Yes.
I wished I knew is the short answer, right? But I would say, so there's been this massive sea change in how we as a profession, frankly, view this, right? So I realize I only have 2 minutes, so let me try to do this quickly here. So again, for the longest time, right, us economists have been running around saying there's one solution. Just, global carbon tax and everything will fall into place. Well, no, that's just not how the world works, right? So yes, there is basically, the political economy story here essentially goes in two directions, one of two directions. One basically says, look, this is a divide and conquer situation. What I mean there is, right, you can either divide and conquer sort of the remaining atmospheric headspace, right? So we are allowed to emit a little bit, X much more in order to meet certain climate goals. And now let's divvy up the spoils. In some sense, this is sort of the rational way of looking at the world, and it's this war situation, right? It's akin to this, look, we are fighting against each other here. The other one is a more optimistic one, and I'm happy to end on an optimistic note here, but it's sort of this optimistic version that says, look, us economists, as much as we would like an efficient solution here, and our whiteboard, blackboard models, right, are all about equilibrating marginal cost and so on. And yes, I teach this stuff too, and of course it's important. Yes, right. The 101 version is crucial here. But at the end of the day, this is not about Econ 101. It's about massive state interests. It's about massive, right, the political economy basically dominating everything else, or to put it more bluntly, politics dominating everything else. Okay, what does that lead to? Frankly, that leads to massive inefficiencies. The fact that Germany is trying to go carbon neutral through basically renewables alone is crazy when you think about it from right? Germany is not particularly sunny most days of the week, right? So no, that's not the place to put massive solar panels from a sort of global efficiency perspective. Does it make sense from a political story within? Of course, right? And I keep coming back to China here, but in some sense, the Chinese Communist Party is onto something here, right? Massive investments, overinvestment. Subsidizing this transition to renewables. Now, what is the result? What is the political result of this, right? This is not, right? China going to war with countries that don't take climate seriously isn't going to be the solution here for them at all, right? It's not going to benefit anyone, let alone them. What is benefiting them is to basically strong arm a whole bunch of other countries. Let's start with Vietnam and Malaysia and, countries in the sort of the sphere of influence of China here, the direct sphere of influence, where the goal of China ought to be to basically strong arm them into wanting to have the same transition and hence buy their solar panels and wind turbines and lithium-ion batteries, right? So is that an efficient solution? No, not at all. Is it an optimistic one? No, not really, not from an economic perspective. Is it an optimistic political path for climate? Yeah, I'd much rather have China strong arm us into buying their stuff than into going to war with anyone, right? And it's that sort of dynamic that, well, where we have seen a massive change over the years, in the last few years. Is that an optimistic story? Yeah, I'd like to think so, right? So it's basically using sort of state sponsorship and industrial policy and all sorts of other fundamental forces to guide things in the right direction, as opposed to the way we are often have been going in the past.
Okay. Thank you, Gernot, very much for your presentation and for the answers on all these questions, which were not easy to answer, I think. But actually, you managed to do it very comprehensively. I think that we had a very important and really interesting food for thought, because actually many people in different places of the world, they look at the green transition from different perspectives. But many people from different parts of the world, so they look at COVID-19 from a more or less single perspective. And I think that, I hope that COVID and the pandemic will help us to look at climate change from the single perspective as well. And I think that the analogs that you set here in your presentation are very helpful instrument for analysis, and are very helpful analogs to make people from different parts of the world to look at climate change as a serious challenge, which is not less serious than the pandemic of coronavirus. Thanks again, Gernot.
Thank you.